So I'm going to show you how you can turn your type from this into this so you can make posters that look like this. All right, no fooling around, let's get into it. So the very first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to set out your type, preferably a serif font, and then you're going to make a smart object with that type as well as a background that is the opposite color of your type. So if you have black type, you're going to want a white background, and if you have white type, you're going to want a black background. It doesn't matter which one you choose, but there will be a difference between the two. So at the end of the video, I'm going to go over both options so that way you can see what the two differences are. But for now, I'm going to go with a white background with black text. So two things to mention before we move on. You can use a sans serif font. I've just found that using a serif font works better since the letter forms tend to have more variety in terms of how thick and thin they are, which kind of plays into some of the effects later on. But you could definitely use a sans serif typeface if you wanted to try that out. Something I'd also recommend is not to put the text in the middle of the canvas. I'll explain why here in a minute. So now that we have our type and our background into a smart object, now we can start applying effects. And really, this is where you can experiment the most and try a bunch of different things, so that way you don't necessarily have to copy exactly what I do here. That being said, there are three effects that I would say are fundamental to getting this effect. The very first one being Gaussian blur. The amount of Gaussian blur will depend on how much you want and also how big your file is, so I really can't give you a direct amount, but you're going to want to give it a good amount of blur. I would rather put too much on it than not enough. Now the next thing you want to add is noise. So as you can see here, I've added quite a bit of noise. It's very noticeable, it's not subtle. I try to push it as much as I possibly can without getting into distorting the text too much. But once again, you can dial this into your own taste. And since it's a smart object, you can even change it later on down the road if you feel like maybe the effect is too harsh using a noise. But just in case you're wondering, I have my noise set at 12.5, but feel free to experiment and see what works best for you. Now the last effect I would say is required is the zigzag effect. So for reference, here are the settings that I'm using. But really, I'm just using this to kind of distort the text and just kind of bend it a little bit and warp it. And one of the cool things about this effect that I really like is it tends to kind of stretch and smear the type in a really cool way. And I really think that this effect helps the type look interesting and unique on its own. But once again, feel free to experiment with the settings, try different things, and figure out whatever works for you and the text that you're working on. Now earlier I mentioned not to put the text in the middle of the canvas. The reason why I said that is because the way that this effect works is it starts in the center of the canvas and then works out. So if you put the text in the direct center of the canvas, you'll actually start to see the ripples in the text effect. So it ruins the illusion that this is natural and chaotic. Instead, you can kind of see the repetition. You can see where the starting point is. So it doesn't really look quite as nice as if you would offset the text from the center. So that way you don't necessarily see the starting point and you can see kind of the repetitiveness of it. Now, if you wanted to, you could definitely stop there as far as the distortion, but I wanted to add just a little bit more, so I added the twirl effect, and then I added the wave effect, and this is pretty much where I ended up. And now there's one last effect to add to get the final result, and that effect will be found in the filter gallery option. So you'll want to apply a filter gallery to the smart object, and then the photocopy option. So for reference, here's the settings that I'm using, but you'll definitely want to kind of tweak this to kind of figure out whichever one that you like best. If you use less detail, it acts more of like a stroke than it does kind of filling in the text. And as you increase the detail, it kind of fills it in. So that way you can find a good balance between the text being filled in and not. So for me, I like it mostly being filled in with just a little bit of empty space because I think it makes it feel a little bit more authentic, almost like it's being stamped. But you know, some of the areas weren't pressed quite as hard, so they're not fully being stamped on there, or something kind of similar to that effect. But obviously use your best judgment and do whatever you feel is right. So here comes the one tedious thing that I would say comes with this effect. So since we added the photocopy effect over the entire image and that image had noise, so now the photocopy filter is interacting with the noise, causing the image to look kind of wonky. So if I zoom in, you can already see that it's kind of showing a bunch of the noise from the image that we don't necessarily want to use. Or maybe you do, but for me personally, I don't really want to use it. So the very last thing that you'll have to do is just go ahead and add a mask around the text. It's pretty simple and it really doesn't take that long. but it is something they have to keep in mind that you have to do. So the last thing that I would recommend is to save this layer as a smart object, so that way you can move around the text without affecting all the distortion layers below it. Because sometimes you'll move it around and that'll affect some of the distortion effects, kind of like where it's positioned on the canvas. And so it's going to interact a little bit differently with the distortion. So if you save it as a smart object, you won't have to worry about that. So now you can set the blend mode to multiply or screen depending on whichever you're using. And now you can move the text wherever you want, however you want it, in whatever way you seem fit. But before I end this video, let me show you the differences between having black text in a white background and white text in a black background. So here's an example of what that looks like. So if I zoom in here, the main difference between the two is if you have white text and a black background, the photocopy effect actually turns into more of a outer glow or a stroke on the outside than it does kind of going inside. But if I move down to the white background with black text, you can see that it's filling inward. So just keep that in mind whichever one you're using. But remember, you can always invert the layers. So if you really wanted to get this exact effect, but you needed a black background instead of a white one, you can do all the steps up until the very end. And then once you have your final smart object, just invert it and then set it to screen. And that way you'll have this exact effect, but with white text instead of black text. And then the same thing goes here if you want black text instead of white text. Just follow the steps, invert it, and then set it to multiply or screen, depending on whichever option you want. So I'm going to show you one last cool thing that you can do with this text. So if you go to filter and then pixelate and then color halftone, you can add a halftone effect to this text. And that looks like this. I have mine set pretty tiny, but you can definitely see what this looks like. So what I do is I duplicate the text layer, add my effect, and then set it to overlay, and then you can get it to look like this. The cool thing is you can also do it to the white text. So you can see here, it's applying it on the inside instead of the outside. This won't drastically change the look of the effect, but it is a nice subtle difference if you're looking to get that effect. So that's all the steps to get this text effect. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll answer those as quickly as I possibly can. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the rest of my channel and then consider subscribing. I hope to see you in the next video.